I always believed that a simple gift could hold a universe inside it. A folded note, a ribbon tied the wrong way, the weight of a box that doesn't seem to matter to anyone else. I spent most of my life avoiding Christmas gatherings, pretending I didn't miss the warmth, the voices, the smells that used to fill my house before silence became my only tradition. But on that particular Christmas Eve, in a quiet town near the old coast of Nova Scotia, I learned that a Secret Santa gift can break a heart open in ways no one expects. And sometimes what breaks also reveals. I didn't plan to attend that family gathering. My son, James, barely spoke to me anymore, and I couldn't blame him. Too many years of distance, too many memories I didn't have the courage to revisit, and a secret I carried alone like a cold stone in my chest. Yet, when my daughter-in-law insisted, saying they wanted everyone together again, I felt something in me shift. Maybe it was loneliness, maybe guilt, or maybe the weight of time finally pressing down. I accepted before I had the chance to retreat into my usual excuses. When I arrived, the house smelled of pine and warm bread, the kind of smell that softens a man's bones and brings back ghosts of better nights. The lights on the tree flickered softly, almost like they were breathing, and voices filled the rooms with a warmth I had forgotten. They had prepared a small bowl for the Secret Santa draw, white papers folded neatly inside. My grandson, Henry, ran around excitedly, asking who I hoped to get. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't know, but because I feared the truth of what might happen if I got the name I both longed for and dreaded. My hand trembled slightly as I pulled a single paper from the bowl. A thin piece of white, nothing more, and yet it felt heavier than anything I had touched in years. When I opened it, my heart stopped. In that small loop of handwriting, I saw the name that had shaped my life, the one tied to every regret and every moment I wished I could rewrite. I told myself it was fate, or punishment, or maybe mercy in disguise. Whatever it was, I realized that sometimes the smallest paper can carry the heaviest truth. And before I continue, before I tell you what was written on that little folded paper and how it changed everything that happened next, I want to know something from you. Where are you listening to this story from? I'm always curious to know where these words land, whose night they accompany, whose memories they stir. If you're feeling the weight of this beginning, or if something in my voice reminds you of your own family stories, feel free to share it, and if you're new here, you might want to follow along, because what happened that Christmas changed not just my life, but the lives of everyone in that room. This is the story of the Secret Santa gift that awakened a truth I had buried for far too long. And it all began with that small folded paper in my hand. The paper stayed in my hand long after everyone else had already put theirs away. I could feel it sticking to my skin, damp from the sweat on my fingers, almost as if it didn't want to let go of me. Around the dining table, the noise returned little by little, like a radio being turned back up after someone lowers the volume to hear something outside. Henry was still laughing, excited about who he might have picked, and the adults were making small comments about how they hoped they wouldn't get a pair of socks again. On the surface, everything sounded light, normal, harmless. Inside me, however, something heavy had woken up, the same old weight pressing against my ribs, reminding me that this Christmas was not like the others. This was the first time in years that I was sitting at the same table as my son without the shield of a screen or the distance of a quick, cold phone call. I watched James from the corner of my eye. He sat across from me, not directly, but close enough that if I stretched my arm, I could almost touch his sleeve. His hair had more gray than I remembered, sprinkled at the temples in a way that made him look older than he should for his age. There was a tiredness in his eyes, not of someone who works too hard, but of someone who has been carrying something unsaid for too long. I recognized that tiredness because I carried the same kind. He laughed at something Walter said, but it was a short laugh, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. For a second, he looked in my direction. His gaze passed across me the way a stranger's would, polite, distant, as if he were looking through a window when I was on the other side, blurred by the glass. Then he turned away again, and that small moment, that small lack of recognition, hurt more than I was willing to admit. The house itself seemed to hold its breath around us. The pine tree in the corner was full of lights that blinked in a soft rhythm, reflecting on the glass door that led to the snowy backyard. I could smell roasted turkey, spices, and something sweet that Margaret had placed near the oven, maybe a pie or some dessert she knew Henry loved. The radiators were doing their best to fight the cold that slipped in under the door, creating that familiar contrast between warm skin and a slightly cold nose. It was a cozy scene, almost perfect, the kind of Christmas you see in movies and think families like mine never get to live. Yet here I was, sitting in the middle of it, feeling like someone who had broken into his own life and wasn't sure if he should be there. I looked at Henry and tried to anchor myself in him. He had my hands, thin and long, always moving, touching things, curious. He was talking about how he wanted his secret Santa to be someone who understood his love for old books and strange toys, and every now and then he glanced at me with a small, shy smile. There was no judgment in his eyes, no anger, just a quiet, pure interest, like he was still trying to figure out who exactly his grandfather was and if he could trust what he would find. Henry had been my bridge back into this house. It was his voice, his curiosity, that had slowly pushed my name back into James's conversations, and I knew it. Children have a way of pulling strings adults thought they had cut for good. Walter, seated at the head of the table, was the opposite of that innocence. He spoke loud, with the confidence of someone who never doubted his own decisions. He had always been part of James's life in a more present way than I had been in the last years, stepping into the spaces I had left empty. I didn't blame him, but every now and then, when he made a comment about responsibility or family, it felt like a thin, polite knife sliding just under my skin. He looked at me every so often, measuring me silently, as if he were still unsure if my presence that night was a blessing or a threat to the fragile balance they had learned to live with. I unfolded the paper again under the table, even though I didn't need to. I had already seen the name written there. The letters were simple, familiar, a name I had repeated thousands of times years ago, a name I had whispered in prayers, shouted in anger, and called out in the dark when I still thought things could be fixed with just one more attempt. The name burned in the center of the paper, and all I could think was how strange it was that something as old as fate could choose such modern, ordinary tools: a bowl, some folded papers, a red pen, and a trembling hand. For a moment, my mind went back to another Christmas, many years before, when the tree had fewer lights, my hair was still dark, and James was just a boy who believed that everything I said was true and everything I did was right. There had been a present then, too, something simple that I had given him with more heart than money, and the look he gave me when he opened it dug a hole in me that never fully closed. That was the night when the first crack appeared between us, even if neither of us realized it at the time. What started with a misunderstood gift slowly grew into silence, resentment, and a distance that no one wanted but both of us helped build. As I sat there, with the new paper in my hand and the old memory in my chest, I realized how similar the two nights were. The same nervous feeling, the same attempt to show love through something I could hold and wrap and hand over. The same fear of failing again. Only this time, there was something else layered under it all, something darker and heavier. A secret tied to another name, a man called John, whose shadow still slipped through the edges of my memory every time I looked at James. The truth I had buried connected those two names like a knot: James, my son, and John, the man whose absence shaped more of our lives than his presence ever could have. The rules of the game were simple. We had a small limit of money to spend, something fair, nothing extravagant. The idea, Margaret had explained, was to keep it light, fun, not turn it into a competition of who could buy the biggest surprise. I listened and nodded, but in my mind, I had already crossed that invisible line. The present I had to choose for the name on my paper would not be about money or fun. It would be, whether I liked it or not, a message. A confession wrapped in plain paper. A key I had kept hidden for far too long. Henry asked if he could help me with the gift later, and I said yes with a tight smile, though my stomach twisted at the thought. How could I let him help me choose something when he didn't know the weight of what I planned to reveal? How could I involve his innocent hands in something that could change the way his father looked at me forever? Yet a small part of me believed that maybe it was right that he was there. Maybe children should not carry burdens, but they can sometimes be the reason adults finally put theirs down. As the evening moved on, the paper in my hand grew soft, almost tearing at the edges. The others folded theirs and slipped them into pockets or placed them carefully into napkins, forgetting about them until it was time for the exchange. I couldn't. Every time I tried to put mine away, it was as if something forced me to look at it again, to face it again, to feel the weight of the name written in that careful red ink. It was not the ink that made my heart race, it was the person behind it, the history attached to it, the secret that now had no place left to hide. Finally, when I could no longer pretend I wasn't trapped in that small detail, I unfolded the paper once more, under the table, hiding the movement like a guilty habit. My eyes found the name again. The letters were steady, almost too neat, as if whoever had written them knew that they were setting something in motion. My chest tightened, and a strange calm, almost like resignation, settled over me. There it was, the answer to the question I had been afraid to ask since I stepped into that house. The name on my Secret Santa paper was James. And deep inside, I knew that this time, the gift I chose for him would not only change his Christmas. It would change the story he believed about his entire life. I used to believe that the past stayed where it belonged, tucked away in corners of memory that only opened when something strong forced them to. But as soon as I saw James's name on that small folded paper, the past didn't just return, it came crashing through me with the weight of a winter storm. It carried smells, sounds, colors, and a pain so familiar that I could almost feel the younger version of myself standing behind me, whispering that I had never really escaped what happened that night. It had been many years since that Christmas, but the memory came back with such clarity that it felt as if someone had opened a door inside my chest that I had nailed shut long ago. Back then, our house was smaller, warmer, messier in the way homes with young children often are. The wooden floors creaked under the weight of tiny running feet, and the fireplace hissed softly, throwing sparks into the air like fireflies trying to escape. Eleanor had filled the kitchen with smells of cinnamon and butter, her hands moving with the grace of someone who found joy in making others feel loved. She hummed something old and gentle as she prepared everything, and I remember thinking that I had never known a woman who made Christmas feel more like a blessing than a holiday. James was still just a boy, maybe 8 or 9, with cheeks always a little flushed from running around and hair that refused to stay brushed, no matter how many times Eleanor tried. That year, money was tight in a way I didn't like to admit. Work had been unstable, and the winter storms had slowed everything down. I felt the pressure in my bones, the kind of tension that keeps a man awake long after everyone else is asleep. I wanted to give James something meaningful, something he would remember, something that said without words that I saw him, that I cared, that even when life felt heavy, he was the reason I kept moving. I had spent weeks carving a small wooden boat for him, shaping it late at night after he went to bed. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, made with my hands, my time, my hope. I remember sanding the edges carefully, imagining him holding it, imagining his eyes lighting up the way only a child's eyes can. When Christmas Eve arrived, the snow was falling steadily outside, covering the world in a quiet white blanket. Inside, the lights from the tree reflected softly on the windows, and everything felt peaceful. James sat by the fireplace, absorbed in a book he had borrowed from school, while Eleanor placed gifts under the tree, humming her melody again. I stood there watching them, feeling a warmth in my chest that I rarely allowed myself to feel. It was a moment so pure, so ordinary, so full of love that I couldn't help but believe that life, despite all its hardness, had given me more than I deserved. When it came time to open presents, James was excited in that loud, unpredictable way children are. He tore through wrapping paper with the energy of someone discovering entire worlds inside those boxes. Eleanor gave him a thick wool sweater she had knitted herself, and he hugged her tightly, thanking her with genuine joy. Then he looked at me, expecting something, and I felt a swell of fear mixed with anticipation. I handed him the small box with the wooden boat tucked inside, wrapped with paper that was slightly crooked because I had run out of tape and used too little. I thought he would laugh at that, maybe tease me gently, but I didn't mind. It was the kind of imperfection that felt honest. He lifted the lid, looked at the boat, and for a moment, I saw the spark in his eyes. A brief light that told me the gift had reached him. But then, as quickly as it appeared, it faded. His smile faltered. He ran his thumb along the boat's edge, paused, and the silence between us shifted. He whispered something I couldn't understand, something small, and then he looked up at me with a kind of disappointment that cut deeper than any spoken words ever could. Not anger. Not rejection. Just disappointment. As if he had expected something grander, something store-bought, something that looked like the toys other children brought to school. I felt the air leave my chest in a slow, painful way. I tried to smile, but the corners of my mouth refused. I told myself he was just a child, that he didn't understand, that one day he would. But the truth was that in that moment, something inside me cracked. Not because of what he did, but because of what I believed it said about the kind of father I was. I had poured everything I had into that small boat, and yet it wasn't enough. It didn't match the world he lived in, the expectations he carried, the comparisons he made. It was as if my love had been measured and found lacking. I saw Eleanor glance at me, concern in her eyes. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but then closed it again. Maybe she thought it was better to let the moment pass. Maybe she feared that speaking would only make the wound deeper. I didn't blame her. In a way, I was relieved she didn't say anything, because I wasn't sure I could trust my voice to hold steady. The rest of the evening moved on, but the warmth had slipped out of the room. James played with his other gifts, laughing again, forgetting the wooden boat on the table as if it were something he didn't know what to do with. I stood there, feeling like an outsider in my own home. Even the tree light seemed dimmer, flickering in a way that felt sad instead of cheerful. That was the night when I first felt the distance forming, not because James meant to create it, but because something inside me couldn't let go of that moment. A father's love is a fragile thing when it is tied to his sense of worth. And mine had always been tied too tightly. Years later, I would learn that the crack from that night became a fault line, widening slowly, silently, turning into the space that now stood between us. But at the time, I just stood there, watching the snow pile against the window, holding onto a wooden boat that still smelled of pine and hope, and wishing I could carve a better version of myself the way I carved toys. The memory lingered as I sat at the Christmas table in the present day, the folded paper in my pocket. It wasn't just a name I had drawn. It was the ghost of that night, returning to demand something I wasn't sure I could give. When I got back home that night, long before the exchange of gifts would take place, I found myself pacing around the quiet rooms like a man searching for something he had lost but didn't know how to name. The invitation to spend Christmas with my family had stirred more than just nervousness in me. It had awakened a part of myself I had worked hard to silence. The stillness of my small house felt heavier than usual, the kind of silence that makes each breath sound too loud, each step echo too much. I turned on a single lamp by the hallway, leaving the rest of the house dim, almost shadowed, as if the walls themselves preferred not to witness what I was about to do. My wardrobe stood against the wall, tall and old, the wood slightly cracked from years of winter air pressing against it. I opened it slowly, and the familiar smell of cedar drifted out, mixed with something faintly sweet, like old paper and the perfume Eleanor used to wear. Even after all these years, that scent clung to certain things I had never managed to throw away. At the very top shelf, tucked behind wool blankets and sweaters I barely used, was the box. I didn't need to see it to know it was there. I could feel the weight of it, like a pulse waiting to be touched. The box was small, dark brown, and worn around the edges. I had kept it hidden not because I was afraid someone would find it, but because I was afraid I would. Every time I tried to open it over the years, my hands would freeze, my chest would tighten, and something inside me would whisper that the past should remain untouched. But the name on the folded paper from the Secret Santa drawer had changed everything. For the first time in years, the box didn't feel like a burden I needed to hide. It felt like a truth I could no longer afford to run from. I carried it gently to the small kitchen table and sat down, letting the box rest in front of me. The house was cold despite the heater humming softly, and I rubbed my hands together before placing them on the lid. My fingers hesitated for a moment, trembling slightly, as if asking for one last chance to turn back. But I couldn't. Not anymore. The box held more than memories. It held the one thread that connected everything I had tried to protect, everything I had tried to bury, and everything that had gone wrong between me and James. When I opened it, a soft sigh escaped me. Inside, neatly kept over the years, were small pieces of my life with Eleanor, pieces of her handwriting, her soft thoughts preserved in ink. There was a photo of the three of us from a summer picnic, James sitting between us with a smile that stretched too wide for his young face, Eleanor leaning into me with a calmness I never fully appreciated until she was gone. Her hair was glowing from the sunlight, wind touching it lightly, and I felt a familiar ache in my chest. I traced her face with my finger, as if touching the photo could bring her closer, even for a second. Under the photo, wrapped in a piece of cloth she had embroidered, was the letter. The letter I had promised myself I would give James someday, but someday had become a word I hid behind. Eleanor wrote it during those final months, when she knew her time was shorter than any of us wanted to admit. She asked me to give it to him when he was older, when he was strong enough, when I was brave enough. But grief turned me into someone I didn't recognize anymore. Instead of giving clarity, I chose silence. Instead of explaining, I chose to protect. Or at least I thought I was protecting him. The truth was that I was protecting myself from facing what she wrote. I unfolded the letter carefully. The paper had softened with time, creased in the corners, but her handwriting remained steady, clear, patient. She always wrote slowly, as if each word carried weight. As I read the first lines, a wave of warmth and sorrow washed over me. She spoke of love, of forgiveness, of the kind of hope only someone who knows they won't see another Christmas can write about. But woven between her words was the truth I had kept hidden all these years, the truth about John, about the mistake, the confusion, the fear, the moment that had spiraled into years of silence. It wasn't my place to change what she had confessed. It was only my place to deliver it. And I had failed. I placed the letter back into the box and leaned back in my chair, feeling a mixture of relief and guilt. The truth waited inside that small wooden container like a living thing. And now, with James's name written on that paper, I knew the time had come to give him what Eleanor had wanted him to have. Whether it healed us or shattered what little remained between us, I could no longer keep it from him. The hardest part wasn't deciding to give the letter. It was figuring out how to wrap it. A letter like that didn't belong inside a fancy box or under shiny paper. It didn't need ribbons or neat corners. It needed honesty, and honesty rarely looks pretty. I found a simple envelope, cream-colored and plain, the kind used for invitations no one wants to send. I placed the letter inside and sealed it slowly, pressing the edge with my thumb. Then I used the same wrapping paper Margaret had given me earlier and folded it carefully around the box, making sure it didn't look too heavy or too important. If James noticed the box before opening it, I wanted him to see something humble, something from my hands, not something that asked too much before it was ready. As I finished tying the ribbon, not too tight, not too loose, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This gift wasn't a test. It wasn't a plea. It was a confession from the past, carried through my hands. Whether James hated me afterward or finally understood me was no longer mine to control. All I could do was deliver the truth as gently as possible. I looked at the box one last time before placing it near the door, ready for the next evening. The house felt even quieter than before. Through the window, snow began to fall again, slow and silent, like ash from a distant fire. It reminded me of how memories settle, layer upon layer, until they become something we must either uncover or be buried under. Before closing the wardrobe, I stood there in the dim hallway, realizing something important. Sometimes the heaviest gifts are not the ones we choose to give, but the ones we have avoided giving for too long. And if you've listened this far, if you've walked through these memories with me, I want to know where you're hearing this from. Stories like this often echo differently depending on where they land, and I'm curious to know how many hearts are following this journey. And if you haven't yet, feel free to follow along, because what comes next is where everything starts to shift. I turned off the hallway lamp, leaving the box waiting by the door for the next night, the night when everything would be opened, including the truth. The next evening arrived with the kind of quiet that makes everything feel heavier than it already is. I woke before the sun, as I often did, but instead of getting up slowly, instead of letting the morning stretch itself along my bones, I sat in the dark for a long time, staring at the gift resting on the small table near the door. Every now and then, a thin ray of cold blue light from the window touched the ribbon and made it glimmer faintly, as if the box were breathing with me, waiting with me, afraid with me. It was strange to think that something so small could carry so much weight, or that a simple ribbon could hold together the pieces of a truth I had spent years trying to keep from unraveling. I made coffee the way I always did, slowly, careful not to let my hands shake. The steam warmed the air around my face, but it did nothing to loosen the knot in my stomach. I sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around the mug, staring at the frost forming on the edges of the window. Outside, the world was white, still, and impossibly calm. Snow covered the streets, the rooftops, even the fence across the road looked like it carried the softness of 1,000 feathers. It should have felt peaceful, but peace has a way of slipping through the cracks when a man is waiting for something he can't avoid. By afternoon, I forced myself to get ready. I buttoned my old coat, the one Eleanor once patched near the pocket, where the fabric had worn thin from years of my hand resting there. I brushed my hair, shaved carefully, making sure I didn't cut myself the way I sometimes did when my mind wandered too far. Then I picked up the gift. The weight of it settled into my palm like a quiet promise, or perhaps a quiet warning. The walk to the house was slow. Snow crunched under my boots, each step sounding louder than it should have in the winter silence. The air was cold enough to sting my cheeks, but I welcomed the burn. It kept me grounded, kept my thoughts from drifting too far into the past. Every few steps, I looked down at the small box held securely in my gloved hand. I wondered how something so delicate could carry the power to change everything, and yet it did. Because what rested inside it was not a gift. It was a truth that had waited long enough. When I reached the house, I paused on the front porch, letting myself take in the glow of the lights through the windows. The warmth inside looked almost golden compared to the pale cold outside. I could hear faint laughter through the door, muffled by the winter air, and it hit me with a strange mixture of longing and caution. I knocked softly, almost hoping no one would hear it. But the door opened quickly, and Henry's face lit up at the sight of me. He pulled me in with a smile so pure it made my chest ache, and suddenly the warmth inside wrapped around me like an old blanket I thought had been thrown away. The house was full, not with noise, but with a kind of gentle chaos that comes from people moving around each other with familiarity. Margaret moved through the living room carrying plates and small bowls, her hair tied back, cheeks flushed from the heat of the kitchen. She greeted me with a warmth that felt real, not forced, and guided me toward the living room where everyone was gathering. The air smelled of roasted meat, cinnamon, and something citrusy I couldn't quite name. It reminded me of old Christmases, but instead of comforting me, it made something tighten behind my ribs. James was there too, standing near the window, adjusting the curtain the way he used to do when he was younger, always needing things to look neat. He froze for a moment when he noticed me. His face didn't soften, but it didn't harden either. It stayed still, unreadable, like someone trying to decide what part of the past they are willing to revisit. He nodded at me, polite, distant, and I felt a small shift inside my chest, a movement that hurt but also reminded me that at least he wasn't turning away. Walter sat in an armchair near the fireplace, watching everything with the quiet intensity of someone who enjoys reading people more than speaking to them. He sipped from a mug, his eyes following me with a measured calm. I never knew exactly what to make of him, but I always felt he could see more than he admitted. His presence didn't bother me, but it didn't comfort me either. It was simply another reminder that tonight, nothing would be simple. As the room filled and everyone settled down, Margaret announced that the Secret Santa exchange would begin soon. The air shifted slightly, excitement mixing with tension, though no one else seemed to feel it the way I did. The children laughed, guessing who got who, while the adults exchanged small smiles and playful glances. But for me, the air felt too thin, heavy with the truth I carried in a small box wrapped with trembling hands. I placed the gift near the tree when no one was looking, trying to hide the way my fingers hesitated. It looked ordinary among the others, nothing special, nothing loud. But I knew it didn't belong there, not in the sense people usually meant. It was a gift only by appearance. In truth, it was a confession wrapped in paper. When I stepped back, my eyes met James's for a moment. He looked at the gift but didn't know it was for him. His gaze lingered only for a second before drifting away again. It was a fleeting moment, but something inside me cracked a little more. I wondered how many years of silence had built that distance, how many misunderstood gestures had fed the space between us. As everyone gathered closer to the tree and the exchange was about to begin, I felt the weight of the room pressing in. The laughter grew softer. The lights flickered against the ornaments. And I knew that the moment James picked up that box, everything that had slept quietly inside our family for years would wake up. Before the first gift was opened, Margaret dimmed the light slightly to make the room cozier. The glow of the fireplace spread softly over the walls, and in that moment, I felt a strange shiver run through me. Not cold. Not fear. Something deeper. A sense that the night had reached a point of no return. And as the first name was called and the game began, I realized that nothing from here would unfold the way I had hoped or feared. It would unfold the way truth always does, slowly at first, then all at once. The moment the first gift was opened, I felt time slow around me, stretching itself in a way that made every movement seem too loud, too bright, too fragile. The room was filled with a gentle warmth, the fireplace crackling softly, the Christmas lights blinking in a steady rhythm that made shadows dance on the walls. People laughed quietly, passing gifts from one pair of hands to another, marveling at small surprises wrapped in cheerful paper. It should have been a simple moment, light and harmless, the kind of memory families collect without realizing. But for me, every second was sharpened by the knowledge that somewhere in that pile of gifts near the tree, hidden like a quiet heartbeat, was the box I brought. And when it reached James's hands, the entire night would change. Henry drifted between the adults, carrying presents to those whose names were called. He moved with the innocence of someone unaware that he was walking through a minefield of emotions. His joy, his soft smile, the glow in his eyes, everything about him made the air feel both heavier and lighter at the same time. I felt the weight of the past pressing on my spine, while the hope in his steps nudged something inside me that had long been buried. Yet even his presence couldn't quiet the storm building inside my chest. Someone opened a set of winter gloves and everyone laughed because they were 2 sizes too big. Another person received a candle that smelled of orange and pine, and Margaret joked about how that scent always reminded her of childhood Sundays. The atmosphere was warm, familiar, safe. But for me, each gift opened tightened a thread inside me, pulling me closer to the moment I feared and needed in equal measure. Then Margaret picked up the next present, a small box wrapped in the paper I had chosen with more trembling than intention. She turned it in her hands, reading the name on the tag, and I felt my breath turn thin. The ribbon shimmered faintly under the lights, and I recognized the slight tilt of my handwriting even from across the room. My heartbeat echoed so loudly in my ears that the room seemed to fade beneath it. Margaret smiled softly and looked toward James. My name didn't need to be spoken. When she extended the box toward him, the air changed. It grew still in a way that wasn't natural. It was the kind of stillness that happens before a storm breaks. James hesitated, his hand lingering in the air for a fraction too long. The hesitation wasn't dramatic, not sharp or cruel. It was quiet, instinctive, and that made it even more painful. He eventually reached for the gift, his eyes brushing past me for the briefest moment, and something inside me shivered. He held the box like he was unsure how heavy it might be, though anyone else would have said it weighed almost nothing. But weight isn't always measured by mass. Sometimes it is measured by truth. And the truth inside that box had waited a lifetime. He began unwrapping it slowly, his fingers moving with caution, as if he suspected something he didn't want to name. The paper came off cleanly, falling into his lap in soft folds. The small wooden box beneath it caught the glow of the tree lights, each carved line showing the years it had been handled, moved, hidden, and avoided. He lifted it, running his thumb along the top, and I saw the moment recognition flickered in his face. Not of the box itself, but of the type of object it was. Something personal. Something intimate. Something dangerous. He opened it. The lid made a soft sound, barely audible over the murmuring in the room. The moment he looked inside, the world held its breath with me. He reached for the envelope first, the cream-colored paper resting on top of everything else. He turned it over, and I saw the exact second he realized it wasn't something Margaret or Walter or anyone else had written. The handwriting was unmistakable. The curves were delicate, slow, thoughtful. Eleanor's handwriting. The room fell silent. He didn't open the envelope right away. Instead, he stared at it as if it had materialized from a ghost's hand. A tightness spread through his jaw, a small twitch near his eye, a stiffness in the way he held his shoulders. I knew these signs. I had watched him navigate difficult emotions since he was a child. But this was different. This wasn't the uncertainty of a boy. This was the controlled restraint of a man facing something he wasn't ready for. Then, without a word, he placed the envelope back inside the box. He closed the lid. And he pushed the gift gently away from him. The movement was small, almost delicate, but the meaning behind it hit me like a winter gust straight to the chest. The room didn't understand, but I did. It wasn't rejection of the box. It wasn't refusal of the gift inside. It was refusal of the truth he feared it contained. The truth he wasn't ready to face. Or maybe the truth he believed I had no right to give him. Heat rose behind my eyes, not burning, but tightening, like grief trying to climb its way out. My hands felt cold even near the fireplace. I could sense the shift in the air, the discomfort spreading quietly through the group as they felt something wrong but didn't know what it was. Walter cleared his throat softly. Margaret forced a small smile. Henry looked confused, turning toward his father with a subtle worry that only a child carries so transparently. And I sat there, feeling as though the room had tilted slightly, throwing me off balance. James finally lifted his head. His eyes passed over the tree, over the floor, over the people in the room. They didn't land on me. Not once. It was as if looking at me would make something fracture inside him. And maybe it would. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I didn't breathe fully. Because in that moment, I realized something important. The truth I had delivered might have been meant to heal us, but healing often begins with breaking. And James had just taken the first step into that pain. But then something unexpected happened. Henry stood up quietly, walked to the tree, and reached for the box his father had pushed aside. He placed it gently back into James's hands. Not forcing. Not questioning. Just returning it. His small fingers lingered on the edge of the box, and for a second, the innocence of that gesture shattered the stillness. James looked at his son. And something changed in his expression, not acceptance, not understanding, not forgiveness, but a small, almost imperceptible crack in the wall he had built. It was enough to start everything that would come next. When Henry placed the box back into James's hands, something inside me shifted, like a loose stone finally dislodging from a wall that had been standing for too long. It was such a simple gesture, a boy returning something his father had tried to push away, but it carried more courage than most adults ever allow themselves to show. For a heartbeat, the room held on to that moment, suspended between what had always been and what was about to start. James didn't pull his hand back. He didn't push the box away again. He just held it, fingers resting on the wooden lid, his shoulders tense, his eyes fixed on a point that seemed to exist somewhere far beyond the walls of that room. The others tried to move the evening along, pretending the silence was nothing more than a natural pause. Someone reached for another gift, someone else made a comment about the food, Margaret tried to bring back the warmth with a small laugh. But there are silences that refuse to be covered. This was one of them. It spread through the room slowly, not loud or dramatic, but dense, like air thickening before a storm. I could feel it wrapping itself around us, especially around me and James, drawing an invisible line that no one else fully understood. James stood up. The movement was calm, almost casual, but my chest tightened anyway. He held the box in one hand, his thumb resting on the edge as if he still wasn't sure whether it belonged to him. For a moment, I thought he might place it on a shelf, abandon it there, walk away, and leave the truth sealed a little longer. Part of me almost hoped he would, afraid of what would happen when the contents were finally released into the light. But another part of me, the part that had carried Eleanor's voice for years, knew that this night existed for this exact reason. That everything leading up to this point, the distance, the guilt, the invitation, even the secret Santa game, had been pushing us toward the same unavoidable cliff. He didn't look at me. He just said he needed some air, his voice low, almost swallowed by the room. Then he walked toward the hallway, the box still in his hand, leaving his empty chair behind like a shadow. Henry watched him go with a slight crease on his forehead, confusion tightening his features, but Margaret squeezed his shoulder gently, guiding him back to the circle near the tree. She was trying to protect him, I could see that, but children feel shifts in the air better than anyone. Henry knew something was wrong, even if he didn't understand what. I stayed seated for a few moments, feeling my pulse hammer in my ears. Every instinct told me to remain where I was, to let James face whatever was inside that box alone, to respect the space he had always demanded. But another instinct, older and deeper, whispered that this was not a moment to leave him on his own. There are certain storms a father should stand beside his son in, even if he is the one who brought the clouds. I stood, my legs heavy, and followed him down the hallway. The house grew quieter with each step, the sounds from the living room fading into a soft blur behind me. At the end of the hallway, near a small side table covered with framed photographs, I found him. He was standing still, back slightly hunched, the box resting there, his fingers pressed against the lid with a tension that made his knuckles pale. One of the photographs beside him showed him as a teenager next to me, both of us younger, unaware of the distance that would grow between us. I wondered if he saw it too, if he recognized the ghost of that moment in the reflection of the glass. He didn't turn when I stopped a few steps away. I didn't move closer. I stayed where I was, close enough to be there, far enough not to crowd him. He stood in silence for a long time, breathing slowly, his shoulders rising and falling in a way that told me he was fighting something inside himself. Fear, maybe. Anger. Or the heavy anticipation of a truth finally dragging itself to the surface. Then he opened the box again. The lid lifted without sound. His hand moved almost mechanically, reaching for the envelope. He turned it over, eyes tracing the familiar handwriting on the front. Eleanor's name wasn't there, but her presence was in every curve of the ink. He had not seen her handwriting in years. That alone was enough to shake a man. He broke the seal. I felt my lungs freeze. The thin tear of paper cut through the quiet, soft but sharp enough to make the moment feel irrevocable. There is a particular kind of finality when an envelope that has waited for years is finally opened. It is like crossing a bridge that can't be uncrossed. He unfolded the letter, and I watched his eyes move along the lines. I had read that letter so many times I could almost hear her words in my head as his gaze traveled from top to bottom. I knew exactly when he reached the part about love, the part about forgiveness, the part where she wrote about how sometimes people protect each other by hiding what they are most afraid of. His shoulders trembled faintly. Then his jaw set more firmly, and I knew he had arrived at the part where the past stopped hiding. Eleanor had written about John. She had written about how, long before James was old enough to understand, before he could remember anything clearly, there had been confusion, mistakes, and a kind of fear that eats away at even the strongest hearts. John had been close to us once, a man I trusted like a brother even when life had drawn different lines between our roles. When everything blurred for a moment, one night, one decision, one mixture of loneliness and weakness, Eleanor found herself caught between truths no one knew how to hold. She had written that James came into the world under a shadow of doubt, a shadow no child should ever have to carry. She had written that we didn't know, at first, whether the blood that pulsed in his tiny body came from me or from John. And then she had written something else. She had written that it was me who decided that the answer would not define him. It was me who chose, in the quiet of a hospital hallway, to sign my name without hesitation, to hold him in my arms not as perhaps, but as my son. She wrote that I had promised her the truth would never be used as a weapon, never be placed like a weight over his heart. That no matter what, I was his father, not because of shared blood, but because I had chosen him, loved him, and built my life around the fact that he was mine. But secrets are not rocks we can throw into the ocean and forget. They are seeds we bury, hoping they never grow roots. Over the years, my fear, my insecurity, my silent questions about what might be true dug into my heart and twisted it. Every time James pulled away, every time he looked at me with disappointment, every time I failed him, some dark part of me wondered whether maybe I was paying the price for a past that had never been fully spoken. Instead of facing that fear, I let it turn into distance. I let it change the way I saw myself, and, without meaning to, I changed the way he saw me. Eleanor's letter spoke all of this, plainly but gently, in her slow, careful handwriting. She told him that if trust had broken between us, it was not because he had been lied to, but because I had been too afraid to tell him the whole story. She asked him, wherever he was when he read those words, to remember that the only mistake greater than what happened in the past would be allowing it to destroy the love that still existed beneath all the rubble. James's fingers tightened around the paper as he read. I watched his breathing grow uneven. He blinked hard once, twice. His lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, I saw the boy he had been, standing in front of me the night he looked at the wooden boat and didn't understand that it carried more than carved wood. That boat had been my attempt to reach him with something of myself. But deep down, I think I always feared that if he knew my whole truth, he would pull away from me anyway. So I failed to tell him. And silence does its own damage. He reached the end of the letter. His hands dropped slowly to his sides, the page still held loosely between his fingers. He didn't turn immediately. He stared at the wall, at nothing, at everything at once. I could almost hear the weight shifting inside him, the confusion, the anger, the sense of betrayal, the ache of realizing that the story of his life had a chapter he had never been allowed to read. I felt the urge to speak, to explain, to apologize all at once. But words felt small against the size of what he had just learned. So I waited. My heart pounded. My throat burned with everything I had never said. Finally, he turned his head slightly, not fully toward me, but enough that I could see his profile. There was no clear emotion on his face, only a storm trying to find shape. He swallowed, eyes shining with a mixture of unshed tears and hard restraint. In that moment, I understood that the letter had done what it was always meant to do. It had broken the ground beneath us, exposing hurt that had been buried for years. But broken ground is also the only place where something new can be planted. I stood there, holding my breath, knowing that from this point on, nothing between us could stay the same. Whether we would fall apart or finally begin to rebuild, I did not yet know. All I knew was that the truth, once opened, has a life of its own. For a long moment after he finished reading, the only sound in that narrow hallway was his breathing and mine, out of sync, searching for a rhythm that did not hurt. I watched his shoulders rise and fall, watched the way his fingers tightened around the letter and then loosened again, as if he didn't know whether to hold on or let it fall to the floor. I had imagined this moment in 100 different ways, usually late at night when the house was dark and my thoughts refused to sleep, but none of those versions felt as fragile as the real thing. In my mind, I had always been more prepared, more composed. In truth, I felt like a man standing on ice that might crack beneath him at any second. There were so many words trapped inside me that I didn't know where to begin. Years of silence had built heavy walls around the truth, and I had grown used to leaning on those walls instead of trying to climb over them. Now they were crumbling, and I realized how much I had depended on them, even as they kept me away from the person I loved most in this world. I wanted to tell him I was sorry. I wanted to tell him I loved him. I wanted to tell him that nothing in that letter had ever changed the way I saw him, even when I failed to show it. But apology, love, and explanation felt too big to fit into one single sentence. He finally turned a little more toward me, not fully, but enough that I could see his eyes. There was no clear anger or forgiveness there, only shock and a deep confusion that made him look both younger and older at the same time. I recognized that look. It was the same one I had seen in the mirror on nights when I thought about Eleanor, about John, about the boy I had promised to raise without letting the past poison his future. I realized then that the letter, as complete as it felt, still did not carry everything. It carried Eleanor's truth, her courage, her confession, her faith in both of us. But it didn't carry mine. It didn't show him the ways I had failed after she died, or the decision I had made alone when the weight of uncertainty became too much to bear. If I kept that last piece hidden, I would only be repeating the same mistake under a different light. I told him, quietly, that what he had read was real, but it was not the end of the story. My own voice sounded strange to my ears, thin and rough, like it hadn't been used for something honest in a long time. I confessed that there was something I had done after Eleanor wrote that letter, something I had never told her, and certainly never told him. The memory rose inside me with such force that I almost felt the hospital linoleum under my feet again, the smell of antiseptic, the buzzing of fluorescent lights above my head. After Eleanor's first surgery, when the doctors told us that her time might be shorter than we hoped, fear settled into me like cold water filling a room. I could not stand not knowing. I could not stand looking at my son and wondering if some part of me was living a lie, even though I had sworn it didn't matter. So one afternoon, without telling anyone, I went to a clinic in the city with a small envelope in my coat and a weight in my chest that made every step heavy. I had taken something of mine, something of James's, and asked for an answer that I had no right to demand. I remembered sitting in the waiting room, surrounded by strangers flipping through old magazines, while my entire world hung on numbers and lines of text still being formed in another part of the building. I told myself that the result wouldn't change anything, that I would love him the same, that I would continue as his father either way. But there was a part of me, ugly and scared, that needed to know whether the blood in his veins carried my history or someone else's. When I went back to get the result, the woman behind the counter handed me a sealed envelope without much expression. To her, it was just paper. To me, it was a mirror. I walked outside into the cold air, sat on a bench, and opened it with hands that wouldn't stay still. The words were clear, clinical, undeniable. James was my son. Not only in choice, not only by my signature on a birth certificate or my attempts at being a father, but in blood. Every doubt, every shadow, every question about his origin evaporated in that moment. He was mine completely. He had always been. I told him this now, in that hallway, my voice unsteady. I told him that I had kept that result hidden, that I never even showed it to Eleanor because by the time I had it, she was too sick, and I was too afraid of what it meant about the man I had become. The truth should have set me free, but instead I used it as one more thing to bury. I let guilt grow around it, twisting it into something heavy and sour. Instead of stepping closer to him with that certainty in my hands, I let my shame push me farther away. I had doubted the one thing that should never have been questioned, my place as his father. I admitted that the worst part wasn't the test itself. It was what I had done long before that, when he was still a teenager, angry at everything, including me. There had been an argument, one of those nights when words flew faster than sense. He had told me I didn't understand him, that I never really tried, that I was good at acting like a father but not at being one. I had been tired, worn down by work, by grief, by the constant pressure of pretending I was stronger than I felt. Something inside me snapped. I said something I should never have even thought, a phrase thrown like a stone, half-muttered but sharp enough that it sliced the air, that maybe he had never really been mine in the first place. I didn't say it as a declaration. I said it as a weapon. And I saw, in that moment, the way it hit him. I saw the way his face froze, the way his chest rose in a short, wounded breath. But instead of taking it back, instead of falling to my knees and begging for forgiveness, I shut down. Pride, fear, and shame locked my mouth. I pretended it didn't matter. I let the words hang between us like a crack in the ceiling that no one repairs. Years later, I would realize that it wasn't just a crack. It was the line where our world eventually split. Standing in that hallway, I told him all of this. Not in long speeches, not with perfect order, but in broken pieces, as honestly as I could. I told him that I had carried the weight of that sentence every day since, that it had eaten at me in every quiet moment, that it had made me believe I didn't deserve to call him my son even after the test proved that I was both his father in choice and in blood. I told him the truth I should have told him years ago, that even if the test had said otherwise, I would still have chosen him. That he had always been enough. That my failure was never about who he was, but about who I was afraid I might be. He didn't speak, but I saw the effect of my words in the way his eyes glistened and then looked away, as if the floor were suddenly more interesting than my face. His fingers, still holding the letter, began to tremble. He turned slightly, leaning his hand on the small table to steady himself. For a moment, I thought he might tell me to leave, that he might walk back into the living room and close the door between us the way he had closed so many other doors over the years. But he didn't move. He just stood there, breathing, while the past rearranged itself inside him. Then his gaze fell back to the box. There, beneath the letter he had just read, was a folded piece of paper I had almost forgotten in my fear. It was the test result, the one I had placed under Eleanor's words before closing the lid. I had done it in a last act of courage, or maybe desperation. I told him there was something else inside, something I wanted him to see with his own eyes. His hand hesitated before he lifted the lid again and reached for it. The paper unfolded easily. His eyes scanned the dry, technical language, the percentages, the markers, the conclusion at the bottom. I watched the moment he understood. Whatever storm had been swirling inside him shifted again. The confusion didn't vanish, and the hurt certainly didn't either, but something new entered the mix, a fragile, hesitant recognition that the story he had just read in the letter had another layer beneath it. He was not the product of a half-kept promise or a question mark. He was my son, entirely, in every way a man can be a father to another human being. The betrayal he felt, the anger, the distance, they were real. But they were not rooted in the fact that his life had been built on a lie. They were rooted in the fact that I had been too weak to live the truth openly. I told him, with all the strength I had left, that I was sorry. Not in the shallow way people toss that word into the air when they want to smooth things over, but in the way a man says it when he knows he can never fully repair what he has broken. I told him I was sorry for doubting, for hiding, for letting fear speak louder than love. I told him I was sorry for every Christmas I spent away from him, for every call I didn't make, for every time I let him think that his disappointment in me was deserved when I could have fought harder to be better. He closed the test results slowly, folded the letter again, and placed both back into the box. Then he rested his hands on either side of it and lowered his head, as if the small square of wood were the only thing holding him up. I wanted to reach out, to put a hand on his shoulder the way I used to when he was little and scared of thunderstorms, but I didn't. I had no right to assume that touch anymore. Not until he chose it. Yet even from where I stood, I felt something in the air shift. The distance between us had not disappeared. The pain had not magically softened. But the story that had lived in his mind all these years had been altered. He was no longer the boy who might not belong. He was the man whose father had failed him in many ways, but not in the one that mattered most at the beginning, the choice to love him as a son, no matter what. The living room sounds drifted faintly back toward us, laughter forced a little too much, the clink of glasses, a song playing softly from a speaker. Life was still happening just a few steps away. But in that narrow hallway, everything had changed. Not resolved. Not healed. Just changed. And sometimes, before forgiveness or reconciliation can even be considered, that is the first necessary miracle. For a long time we stayed in that hallway, suspended between past and present, between everything that had already been broken and everything that still might be rebuilt. The house around us carried on breathing with soft sounds, the muffled conversations, the clinking of silverware, the shuffling of chairs, but inside that narrow corridor, time behaved differently. It was as if the walls themselves were listening, afraid to interrupt what was unfolding. James stood with his hands resting on the box, head bowed, shoulders tight, the way a man stands when he realizes the ground beneath him is not what he thought it was. I watched him quietly, afraid to move, afraid to disturb whatever delicate shift was happening inside him. I felt the heaviness of all those lost years pressing against my ribs. I thought about every Christmas I had spent alone, telling myself it didn't matter, telling myself I had learned to live without what I once had. But loneliness is a kind of illusion. You can convince yourself you've grown used to it, but the truth is you only stop feeling its weight when you are standing in front of something you thought you'd never have again. In that hallway, looking at my son wrestling with the truth, I realized I had been hungry for this moment long before I ever admitted it. James lifted his head slowly. His eyes were red, but not from tears. He was too restrained, too controlled for that. His restraint had always been his armor. But the shine in his eyes, that slight tremble that he tried to hide, was louder than any tear. He looked at me not with anger, not with the sharpness of rejection, but with something more difficult to bear, hurt mixed with recognition. The kind that comes when a man finally understands the size of the wound he has been carrying without knowing its origin. And in that moment, something inside me fractured. Not painfully, not sharply, but in a way that felt like ice thawing, slow and inevitable. I realized what he needed wasn't an explanation anymore. It wasn't more truth or confession or justification. He needed space to feel everything that had just risen inside him. But he also needed to know, truly know, that I was still there. Not as a ghost peeking from the edge of family gatherings, not as a visitor no one expected, not as a man too afraid to confront what he had broken. But as his father. I took a small step forward. Not enough to crowd him, just enough for him to sense that I was no longer hiding behind distance or fear. He looked down again, hands gripping the edges of the box, and for a moment I wondered if this would be the point where he walked away. But he didn't move. He stood there, breathing unsteadily, fighting through everything Eleanor's words had awakened. I spoke softly, not with authority, not with desperation, but with the tired honesty of a man who finally understood the cost of silence. I told him that I never doubted he was my son, not truly, not in the place that mattered. I told him that even when fear made me question myself, even when insecurity whispered lies into my ear, the part of me that carried him as a baby, that sat beside him during fevers, that carved wooden toys late at night, that part had always known. I told him that I failed him not because of the truth, but because of my fear of losing him. And fear, once it takes root, grows faster than love if you let it. His jaw tightened, and I saw his throat move with a small swallow. He still didn't speak, but silence wasn't his shield anymore. It was the space where new things were beginning to rise. There was a moment, so small I almost missed it, when his hand loosened on the box. His grip softened, fingers no longer curled with tension. He closed the lid gently, as if protecting what was inside rather than pushing it away. That small gesture did more to crack me open than any words could have. It was the first sign that he wasn't shutting the door between us again, that he wasn't choosing to walk away like he could have, like he once had. I felt tears sting behind my eyes, not sharp, but warm, a kind of warmth I hadn't felt in years. I took another step, slow and deliberate, and when I stopped, I was close enough to see the rise and fall of his breathing. He didn't pull away. He didn't look at me. But he didn't move back either. So I said the one thing I should have told him long before that hallway, long before the silence stretched between us like a frozen lake. I told him I loved him. Not as an apology, not as an attempt to fix everything at once, but as the simple truth it had always been. I said it quietly, the words trembling but honest, and for a second I thought the weight of them might crush me. Then something happened that caught me so off guard I nearly forgot how to breathe. James set the box down on the table beside us. Slowly, he turned toward me, not fully, just enough for me to see the expression on his face change. His eyes met mine, and for the first time in years, he didn't look through me or past me. He looked at me. Really looked. And then, in emotion so small at first I wasn't sure I saw it, he stepped forward. Just a fraction of a step. But it was enough. Enough for me to understand that he wasn't running. That he wasn't closing himself off. That despite the storm of truths and hurt swirling inside him, he was choosing, hesitantly, painfully, to stay. I moved closer and raised a hand, slow as someone approaching a wounded animal, afraid to do harm. I paused, giving him the chance to walk away, to refuse, to end the moment before it became something deeper. But he didn't move. His eyes softened, barely, but enough to break what was left of my restraint. I placed my hand on his shoulder. He inhaled sharply, not in pain, but in recognition, like something inside him had been waiting for that touch longer than either of us realized. I felt the coldness of his coat beneath my palm and the warmth of the man beneath it. His breath trembled once. Then twice. And then, finally, he stepped into me. Not with certainty, not with the fierce grip of forgiveness, but with the fragile, trembling lean of someone who had fought too long alone. I wrapped my arms around him, afraid to hold too tightly, afraid to crush the moment, but unable to stop myself from pressing my cheek to his hair the way I once did when he was small and storms frightened him. He didn't hug me back fully, but he didn't pull away. His head lowered against my shoulder, his breath shaking against my neck, and that was enough. More than enough. It was more than I had dared to hope for. It was the embrace I had waited my whole life for, not perfect, not complete, but real. Painful. Honest. Human. We stood there, two grown men held together by decades of mistakes and love that had almost drowned under silence. And in that quiet, fragile moment, something opened inside both of us. Not healing, not yet. But the doorway to it. From the living room, I heard Henry's voice calling for his father, bright and innocent, a reminder that the world outside that hallway still needed us. James lifted his head slightly, wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve, and took a slow breath. He didn't smile, not fully. But there was a softness in his expression I hadn't seen in decades. He picked up the box again, not to refuse it, not to hide it, but to carry it with him. And when he walked back toward the living room, he didn't walk ahead of me. He walked beside me. It was the smallest miracle I could have asked for. And the greatest one I had ever received. Years later, I would still remember the way the living room looked when we stepped back into it, warm and bright, with soft music playing, the tree lights blinking gently, and the quiet hum of voices folding themselves into the air like a blanket. But on that night, right after the hallway had swallowed and reshaped everything between us, the room felt different. Not because anything had changed outwardly. The decorations were the same, the smell of cinnamon and roasted meat still floated through the air, Henry still sat on the floor surrounded by torn wrapping paper and toys. But the weight inside me had shifted in a way I could only describe as a loosening. Not gone. Not resolved. But loosened, as if the chain around my chest had been pulled open just enough to allow breath to move freely again. James entered first, holding the wooden box with a grip that was no longer tense but careful, like someone carrying something fragile and important. I walked just a step behind him, not touching, not guiding, just present. I didn't need anything more than that. Margaret looked up when we came in. She didn't say a word, but I saw her eyes take in the sight of James's face, the faint trace of moisture at the corner of his eyes, the way he placed the box gently on the table instead of setting it aside. She gave the smallest nod, the kind only someone who understands more than they ask would offer. Henry stood and rushed to his father, touching his arm with concern that had not faded since James left the room. James knelt to him and whispered something I couldn't hear, something soft, because Henry's expression relaxed almost instantly. The boy hugged his father's neck, and James held him close, letting the small arms wrap around him with a trust that had never been shaken. Watching them, I felt the smallest ache, a mixture of regret and gratitude. Regret for what I had lost during those years of distance. Gratitude for the fact that the boy still saw his father as something untouchable, unbroken, safe. Children forgive faster than adults, because their hearts have not yet learned the heaviness of pride. Eventually, the room eased back into its rhythm. The gifts were opened, the paper torn in excited bursts, the adults laughed softly at mismatched scarves and novelty mugs, and someone turned up the music slightly. Conversations moved around me like gentle currents. I answered when spoken to, smiled when appropriate, but inside I felt as if I were walking through a memory not yet finished. Every now and then, my eyes found James across the room. He didn't avoid me the way he once did. He didn't stare with confusion or anger. Instead, he held my gaze when it happened naturally, steady and calm, almost as though we had agreed on some silent truth in the hallway. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a beginning. And beginnings, I had learned far too late, are sometimes more important than endings. When the night finally wound down, coats were gathered from hooks, boots pulled from beside the heater, and people hugged each other in the doorway, promising to meet again soon, even though everyone knew that some promises fade as quickly as the steam on winter windows. I stood near the tree, watching Henry hop around trying to put on one boot while balancing on the other foot. Margaret thanked me for coming, her voice gentle, genuine. Walter offered a firm nod from across the room, which was his way of acknowledging that something significant had happened without prying into the details. I appreciated that more than he knew. James approached me last. He held the box in one hand, not offering it, not hiding it. Just holding it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The quiet between us wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't sharp or cold. It was just quiet, the kind that exists when two people are trying to understand each other again after years of walking separate paths. He looked at the door, then at me, then back at the box, and I saw something small shift in his eyes. Not clarity. Not full acceptance. But openness. He said that he would read the letter again when he got home. He said he needed time to understand everything. He said he didn't know how he felt yet, not exactly, not completely. But he looked at me directly when he said that he didn't want the night to end the way so many others had ended before, with distance filling the space between us. He didn't want to go back to how things were. I felt something inside me rise, a quiet warmth that had nothing to do with the fireplace. I nodded, not trusting my voice. I realized then that sometimes a man can receive a gift without taking it in his hands. Sometimes a gift is just a sentence spoken at the right moment, after years of silence. Before he left, Henry ran up to me and hugged me tightly around the waist, the top of his head warm against my coat. He told me he hoped I would come again next Christmas. I placed my hand on the back of his small head, feeling the softness of his hair and the steady beat of hope in him. I said that I would, if they wanted me. He said that he wanted me, and that was enough. When the door finally closed behind them, the house felt strangely large and quiet again. The tree lights hummed softly in the silence. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where they had stood, the cold from outside lingering in the air they left behind. I sat down slowly on the couch, letting the quiet settle around me. And for the first time in many years, the quiet didn't feel like punishment. It felt like a pause. A breath. A moment between chapters. That night, as I turned off the lights one by one, I thought about the meaning of Secret Santa. People think it's about giving something without being named, about surprises and harmless fun. But I realized that the truest version of that tradition had unfolded in my hands this year. A real Secret Santa is not someone who hides their name. It is someone who gives something they have held too long in silence. A truth. A confession. A history. A beginning. As I lay down in the quiet of my home, I understood that the greatest gift I had ever given was not the box or the letter or the test result. It was the chance for my son to see the man I truly was, not perfect, not brave in the right moments, not always strong, not always right. But human. Flawed. Trying. Still reaching. And the greatest gift I received was not forgiveness, not yet, but something just as precious, the opportunity to try again. Christmas is not about perfect families or perfect moments. It is about the courage to open doors you closed yourself. It is about the fragile miracle of a second chance. And that night, I received mine.